Tony and I, and one of the great stalwarts of the New Zealand environment and outdoors, John Henderson, were the three that went to see the ministers. And what year, what government was that?
Alan Hyatt was the minister.
Yeah, and stopped trout farming right back then. And we actually travelled New Zealand and did some amazing talks and stuff. And one of the things I wrote about was that the people were really, in those days, went to political meetings, and Muldoon would fill a town hall, and everybody would heckle Muldoon because he just loved the hecklers. And cut that man out, you know. And eventually, there was so many people heckling him over the times about trout farming. He said, "There'll be no bloody trout farming when I'm the Prime Minister." So anyway, we went to see them, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
And said, well, you guys promised it, you're the Prime Minister promised it, and are you going to keep your promise? And they've kept it right up to now because they're all scared of the hunters and fishermen, or the fishermen in particular. It was a big lobby group because Tony might talk about it, but they got an MP, a minister, kicked out of Parliament, basically. So it was a powerful group, and we need to get them powerful again. But I have great pleasure in welcoming Tony. He's done 27 books, I think. Mm-hmm. Tony's been the editor of major papers, including Federated Farmers and the Marlborough Times and all the rest. So, Tony, over to you, and thank you very much for coming.
Well, sit down if I may. Alan's quite right in recalling that we went round Parliament corridors. In those days, you could walk into Parliament, walk down the corridor, knock on the door and go in and talk to an MP. You don't do it now. And it resulted in some interesting experiences. On the trout farming one, I went into Bob Tizard's office. You may recall Bob Tizard as a minister. And I said, I've come to see you about trout farming, I'm opposed to it. And he just let go with an explosion at me. Get out of here. He said, I'm a scientist, you're not, go, out. And he didn't want to talk to me. He not even discuss it. But on the other hand, people like Phil Amos, I became quite good friends with Phil Amos. He was a keen trout fisherman and he knew what it was about. And so I was able to, through that, influence the Labour Party, and in the Marlborough Labour MP at the time, Ian Brooks, arranged for me to see Norman Kirk. And I was very impressed with Kirk. I met him in the lobby outside the house there, and this great big guy came down, and the piles of the house virtually shook as he walked. He was so big. And he sat down, he says, righto, tell us about it, trout farming. And he just sat there and he listened, and that's the key thing, he listened. And I expounded my views on why trout farming would be a disaster economically and environmentally, and he said, I'll be in touch. And 6 weeks later, Labour came out opposed to trout farming, whereas National stuck to their old ideal, led by Duncan McIntyre at the time. And I got embroiled in quite a scrap in the Hastings electorate, where I was in Hawke's Bay, and that was Duncan McIntyre's electorate. I got bailed up against the BNZ building in Heratonga Street by the president of the National Party, who shouted and yelled at me that I was writing scurrilous letters to the paper. And I didn't know.
Still is.
Yeah, I still am. And then the National Party, I just walked away from them actually, and the National Party then tried to get me to join the National Party. The secretary invited me over, said, I think you'd be better working from within, join the National Party, and I was given tea and scones and all this sort of stuff, and I said no, I'll remain independent. So there's been some great battles there, and the latest thing that this Ardern government has done is making a power grab for fish and game councils, which are democratically elected by the licence holder public, and they want to put in state control with government commissioners with voting powers, etc. But this goes way, way back, this issue, and in 1974 I wrote to the Labour government, and in particular the Minister of Internal Affairs, Henry May, about a plan called the Hun Commission to take over acclimatisation societies. Now, acclimatisation societies were the forerunner of Fish and Game. They changed to Fish and Game about 1990. The proposal of Henry May was a thinly disguised attempt to impose state control on the politically independent acclimatisation society structure, which had democratically elected councils. Most concerning was the proposal for a national executive which would see the sportsmen's representatives in a minority. Politely but firmly I made my opposition clear, and I wasn't alone. Many trout anglers and duck shooters felt the same way too. The reply from Henry May was startling. In a 3-page typed letter, he ranted back about how great his scheme was for government control, and then berated me as being, quote, ignorant, emotionally obsessed and loose with the facts. I consulted my friend John Henderson, who Alan referred to earlier. He was president of the NZDA, New Zealand Deer Stalkers, about the 3-page tirade. His response was to laugh. "You've hit a raw nerve, lad," he explained. "If you hadn't, they would have brushed you off with the polite, thank you for your views." My friend's reaction to Minister Henry May's tirade was that it was appalling for a public servant. What happened to democracy and the people's viewpoint to what a plonker? A bad joke plus one or two friends, among them Alan Simmons, laughingly suggested Henry May had correctly psychoanalysed me. I then sought an interview with Prime Minister Bill Rowling in Picton, which came into his electorate in those days. Norman Kirk had died in office and was replaced by Bill Rowling, who frankly was probably one of the most ineffective Prime Ministers we've had. So Ted Basin, a good friend, and I walked into the office and the interview room in Oxley's Hotel at Picton, and I said to Bill Rowling, excuse me, "I'm Tony Orman," and I was about to introduce Ted Basin, and Rowling erupted at me. And he shouted, "I know who you are. You took a swing at my minister." And he continued to shout, and Ted and I stood there rather bemused by all this. And Rowling realised we weren't shouting back and suddenly said, "Oh, what did you come to see me about?" I mean, the guy was absolutely hopeless, and that was the PM. It was bizarre and unreal, but it was happening. But the imposition of state control of acclimatisation societies was nothing new. Back in those days, the Hun Commission admitted this was the 10th attempt. So this year's attempt by the Ardern-led government via the Department of Conservation is probably about number 15 or 16 as best I can work out. And like state bully boy Henry May's scheme, the proposals would see government appointees or state puppets on not only the National Council but on regional fish and game councils too. New Zealand governments have been trying to grab control of the democratically elected fish and game organisation for decades. I'd just like to refer to something that the media continually say, and most people do. I mentioned Ardern, Jacinda Ardern, and people refer to the Prime Minister as our leader. Now, I never say they're our leader. I have said, and in print too, they are simply the most senior public servant in the land. And so that's something that I suggest you stick to. And when they refer to the Prime Minister, and in this case Ardern, as the leader, you challenge it and say, no, she's not, she's a public servant. In 2017, former Prime Minister Geoffrey Palmer wrote a startling blog post expressing concern about the state of democracy. It should have been headline news, but it wasn't, which raises a large question mark about the media's competency. Excuse me. Palmer's statement was aimed at a national government led by John Key. Palmer had very good reason to be concerned. On April Fool's Day 2010, Nick Smith, then Minister for the Environment and Government, along with his colleagues and John Key, sacked the democratically elected Environment Canterbury, known as ECAN, and replaced it with state commissioners by passing the ECAN Act. The move outraged the Law Society Rule of Law Committee, which denounced the ECAN Act as repugnant to the rule of law. Most were appalled, but it went through, pushed by Nick Smith. But when you think about it, back to 1984 and Geoffrey Palmer's involvement in politics, he was very guilty of hypocrisy. 1984 is incidentally the title of George Orwell's famous novel about Big Brother is watching you. In 1984, Palmer, as a senior cabinet minister, was in the fourth government which had swept to power at the election of 1984, promising open government and giving people the say. It started well, led by David Longy, the PM. They held a big summit conference, proclaiming a new day in democracy and public consultation. But within months, Rogernomics was born and democracy went into the incinerator. Public assets were sold without asking the owners, the public. Democracy was under attack. So the erosion has gone on and is accelerating today, as Geoffrey Palmer hypocritically warned in 2017. Because I'm familiar with outdoor issues, I'll deal with those particularly. And in April 2016, Nick Smith was at his dictatorial best when he removed the right of local councils to consider and hear submissions on 1080 poison. And he put the final and only say with central government and with himself as Minister for the Environment. Public input was virtually abolished. Strangely, philosophically for a national government, the 1080 issue and the ECAN takeover were dictatorial state control measures. I can remember making submissions on trout farming in the early 1970s, and in the case of the Trout Farming Select Committee, I was in front of the Select Committee for an hour and a half. To the Maori Fisheries Bill in 1990, I was granted over an hour, but by then the signs were showing because two MPs, Bill Sutton and Ken Shirley, who's formerly of Nelson, they made an aggressive attack on me, particularly Ken Shirley, who was meant to be the chairman and listening, and I was really getting a hard time, these two guys at me, but I argued back. So then in through the door came one Winston Peters, and he quickly summed the situation up, and he got stuck into Sutton and Shirley and ripped them up verbally. And I was sitting there, they were meant to be listening to me, and I was sitting there like this, like watching a tennis game. And anyhow, in the end, I complained later on, and I got an apology out of Bill Sutton, who was the MP for Hawke's Bay, and Ken Shirley wouldn't apologise. But so that was over the Maori Fisheries Bill that I had over an hour before the Select Committee. And just dwelling on that issue of the Maori Fisheries Bill, which was selling, to me it was selling a public resource or giving a public resource to another group on ethnic grounds, which I felt was against our egalitarian spirit and society. John Henderson and I went to see Trevor DeClean, who was the Attorney General in the Labour government, and we knew Trevor through deer stalking. Trevor was a keen hunter, and I remember sitting down there, and he says, "Righto, you guys, what do you got to see me about?" And John said, "We come to see you about the Maori Fisheries Bill," and we explained our concerns briefly, and Trevor leant back and said, "I feel like effing off to Australia." He said, "I am powerless to do anything about it." And so I just give you that little snippet in line with what is happening today with some of the demands that are coming from Maori activists. And when I say Maori activists, don't be guilty of stereotyping all Maoris. The chap I mentioned earlier, Ted Basin, who was with me when Bill Rolling exploded at us, he was a strongly Maori blood. He would have been about 50%. A fine guy, principled, one of my best friends, and he had no time for this division in society that has gone on. And my current neighbour, I've got a son-in-law who's a Maori. I couldn't wish for a better husband for my daughter. The neighbour where I live in Blenheim is a Maori guy, strongly Maori, a terrific neighbour. So don't stereotype Maoris. Realise I reckon it's about a 3% of Maori people who are making all the noise and the strident demands, etc. The other issue that I had, just to cite, was the government's Irma review of 1080 in about 2007. And what made me suspicious for a start was the two big poison spreaders, Osprey, that is the former Animal Health, and DOC, had requested the review. Now, they wouldn't request that review as the two biggest poison spreaders unless they knew what the outcome would be. I saw that as a strong pointer to it being a farce. The Irma review ended up giving 1080 the green light, but what alarmed me most of all was the erosion of democracy. They said, we will give every person 5 minutes to speak. Now, for me to fly from Blenheim and possibly have accommodation, it was probably going to cost me $300 or $400 for 5 minutes. And so I just didn't give my submission. John Henderson delivered mine because he lived in Wellington. I'm a member of the Council of Outdoor Recreation Associations of New Zealand, and last year we raised red flags that Parliament's Select Committee process was being undermined to the detriment of the public submissions. Current Chairman Andy Cockcroft made an oral submission. He was given 15 minutes to speak. At the 5-minute mark, Duncan Webb, the MP for Labour for Christchurch Central, interrupted him and said, "Thank you, we've heard enough, you can go now," and dismissed Andy out the door. So he had been accorded 15 minutes for a start, and Duncan Webb said, "No way, after 5 minutes, out you go." Now, I find this an absolute insult. Interestingly, Duncan Webb advertises you in the Christchurch Press, and he says, "I'm here to listen." Duncan Webb, Labour MP. The national government was voted out in 2017, but the new coalition government of Labour, Greens and New Zealand First continued the trend of diminishing democracy. Firearm law changes following the Christchurch March the 15th mosque tragedy were rushed through in just a few days. They had over 12,000 submissions, and they're asking us to believe that they looked at those in 2 days. It's not just outdoors related either. Recently, the Labour government pushed the Maori Wards Bill through its reading in Parliament in a few days. Jordan Williams, Executive Director of the Taxpayers Union, said, "This law is a brazen attempt to hijack local democracy, and the use of parliamentary urgency betrays the promise of open and transparent government." Whether the issue is firearm laws, 1080, ECAN, Maori wards, what is important and paramount to realise is the erosion bordering on abandoning democracy. Some columnists have examined the erosion of democracy. A number have identified complacency by the public, or in other words, apathy. Recently, Carl Dufresne, who's a very good journalist, looked at complacency, saying one thing we do very well in this country, besides rugby, is evasion of responsibility. We get reports and inquiries hollow apologies and hand-wringing, and then it's back to business as usual. He found there is a glaring accountability deficit throughout the country. There's just one little quote too I think is worth remembering. There's a chap, Plato, a Greek philosopher, a long time ago, and he wrote, "The price of apathy is to be ruled by evil men." And I think you're seeing that now. The public believe Parliament is a place of democracy where you could get a fair hearing from elected representatives based on a historical and moral constitution of honour, truth and justice. It is not a charade, but it is a charade more than a bad joke. Little wonder then that the public rates politicians, political parties and governments as among the most untrustworthy. You're in the political game, keep your integrity, advocate for democracy because it's the number one issue heading into 2023. Best wishes for the rest of your AGM. I hope it's a great one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.